Her breath caught in her throat as a cold chill ran through her. What had he done? And who was this man she had married, really? The suspense that had built up over the past week began to erupt. As she sat in the dimly lit study, her world started to feel as though it was slipping from her grasp. The life she had imagined for herself was now clouded with doubts, and the man she had married seemed more like a stranger by the second. Her mind raced as she wondered what terrible secrets he was hiding, and what they would mean for their future together. The young woman knew she had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that the answers she sought might destroy everything she thought she knew about him, and about herself. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling silence. Her husband seemed to withdraw even more, his actions becoming more erratic. He would sit by the window for hours, staring out into the distance, as if waiting for something, or someone, to arrive. She could no longer ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The luxury and comfort she had once adored now felt like a gilded cage, and the mansion, once a symbol of her newfound life, seemed more like a prison. Her suspicions grew stronger when she found a set of keys she had never seen before. They were old, worn, and didn't seem to belong to any of the doors in the house. She tried asking him about them, but he dismissed her with a shrug and a simple, "Oh, just some old things from my past." The unease in her heart only deepened. She had married a man who had promised to share everything with her, yet he was hiding things that no marriage should have secrets about. She decided that she would get answers, no matter how difficult it was. The thought of living in a relationship built on lies filled her with dread, but she could no longer sit in the shadows of his silence. One afternoon, when her husband was out on one of his mysterious errands, she took a bold step. She went into the study again, this time with the intent to uncover whatever secrets he had buried. She had no plan other than to look for anything that might give her a clue about his past. She scanned the shelves of books, the drawers of his desk, and even checked the floorboards for anything hidden away. It wasn't until she opened the back of a dusty old cabinet that she found something that chilled her to the bone, a small, locked box. Her heart raced as she carefully opened it, her hands trembling. Inside, there were photographs of her husband with men she didn't recognize, people who seemed to be involved in business dealings that looked far from legitimate. There were also documents filled with names she had never heard of, names that sounded dangerous, menacing even. Her breath caught in her throat. What was this? Was her husband involved in something illegal? Something that had the power to tear apart everything she had come to trust about him? Her mind reeled as she processed the implications of what she had found. The millionaire she had married, the man she thought she had known, had a hidden life filled with mysteries. And now, she was a part of it. The box also contained a strange letter, written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. The letter mentioned a woman named Eliza, and it spoke of a promise to protect someone, but the details were vague. It was signed by a name that her husband had never mentioned. The cryptic nature of it only added to her growing dread. She didn't know what to do next. The truth, if it was as dark as she feared, could destroy her. Could she really stay married to a man who had this kind of secret life? The thought of walking away from the life she had dreamed of was unbearable, but the thought of living a lie was worse. The more she thought about it, the more questions flooded her mind. Why had he kept all this hidden? What was he trying to protect her from? And, most pressing of all, what was he so afraid of? The young woman's emotions were torn between confusion, fear, and anger. She wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers. But part of her feared what those answers might reveal. What if everything she had come to love about him was a facade, just another lie he had crafted to keep her in the dark? She couldn't let it go. The tension that had been building in her heart now pushed her to act. The truth had to come out, no matter what it cost. The question was, would she still love him when she finally understood the full extent of the secrets he was hiding? Or would she find herself trapped in a life she no longer recognized? When her husband returned that evening, she was ready. She would confront him. The time for hiding from the truth was over. The young woman had no idea what the next few moments would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: the answers she sought were going to change everything. The evening was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. The young woman waited in the living room, her heart hammering in her chest as she heard the sound of her husband's footsteps coming up the staircase. He was home. She had made up her mind. Tonight, she would confront him. No more secrets. No more wondering. As he entered the room, she could see the weariness in his eyes, the same strange distance that had settled over him these past few days. He smiled at her weakly, as if nothing was wrong, but she could tell he knew something was off. His gaze darted to the floor, and he shifted uneasily. He had never been this uncomfortable around her before. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice steady but strained. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, fighting the urge to tremble. He hesitated, looking like he might refuse, but then nodded slowly and sat down across from her. "Of course, what's on your mind?" His voice was calm, too calm, and it made her skin crawl. He was hiding something. He was always hiding something. "I found something," she began, her words coming out in a rush. "Something I didn't expect to find." He froze at her words, his eyes widening just slightly. She knew then that whatever she had uncovered was more than he had planned to reveal. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. She could see he was already preparing for a fight, but she wouldn't let him off so easily this time. "I found the letters," she said, her voice shaking now with a mix of anger and frustration. "And the box. The photographs. The names. What is all of this, Henry? What have you been hiding from me?" His face darkened, the smile falling from his lips. The shift was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her heart sink. She had caught him off guard, and now she could see the cracks in the facade he had carefully built. "I told you before, there are things in my past that don't concern you," he replied, his voice colder now, like he was shutting her out. "You don't need to know about it." But she wasn't backing down this time. Her voice grew louder, filled with a mix of anger and hurt. "I married you. I trusted you. I thought I knew who you were, but now I don't know anything. You've been lying to me this whole time, haven't you?" He stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. His face was a storm of emotions, none of them good. "It's not what you think," he muttered, his hands running through his hair as if the pressure was too much to bear. "I never wanted you to find out. I never wanted you to be involved in this." "Too late for that," she snapped. "I'm already involved. You've dragged me into whatever mess you've been keeping hidden for all these years. And now, I deserve the truth." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes suddenly soft with a mixture of regret. "And something else, fear? I didn't want this life for you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there are things I've done, things I've been a part of, that I can't escape from. You don't understand what it means to be involved in the kind of world I've been in. There are people who would hurt you if they knew who you were to me." The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had always known there was something off about his past, but hearing him admit it, hearing the fear in his voice, made it all too real. Her mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. People who would hurt her? What kind of life had she married into? "What do you mean, people who would hurt me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper as she fought to stay calm. She needed to know more, but the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a marriage to a wealthy man, this was a marriage tangled in dangerous secrets. "I've made enemies," he said, his voice thick with the weight of years of regret. "Powerful ones. People who don't take kindly to those who betray them. I've tried to protect you from that, but it's getting harder." Her mind reeled. Betrayal? Enemies? The life she thought she had signed up for, the life filled with wealth and security, was crumbling in front of her. She didn't know if she could handle the truth anymore. She had married a man who had done things she couldn't even imagine, and now those things were threatening to tear them apart. The fear she felt wasn't just about the danger her husband's past could bring into their lives, It was about the realization that she didn't know him as well as she had thought. The man she had married was a stranger to her, a man who had hidden his true self for so long that it was now impossible to see who he really was. But even as the weight of his words hung in the air, she knew one thing: she had to get to the bottom of this. The truth, however painful, was the only thing that could save them. If they were going to have any chance at surviving this, she had to know everything. Even if it meant uncovering things that would shatter her world forever. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of his words lingering like a heavy fog. The young woman felt the walls close in around her. She had always believed in the fairness of life, that love was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where nothing could hurt her. But now, she stood at the edge of a truth that seemed too dark to grasp. "I never wanted you to be a part of this," her husband repeated, his voice soft, almost pleading. "I wanted to give you a life you could be proud of. I never wanted you to see this side of me." His hands shook as he ran them through his thinning hair. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but it did little to ease the chaos building in her chest. "Then why did you marry me?" she asked, her voice trembling, though she fought to keep control. "Why did you bring me into this if you knew it was all built on lies?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "Because I thought I could protect you. I thought I could keep you away from the danger, but now it's getting closer. You're already too deep. You've seen too much." Her stomach churned with a mix of anger and confusion. "What danger? Who are these people? What have you been involved in?" Her husband's expression faltered, and for a moment, he seemed to wrestle with whether or not he should reveal more. His eyes darted to the window, as if he feared someone might be watching them from outside. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was involved with a group of powerful people, criminals, really. They used my wealth to hide their tracks, to do things that were unspeakable. I thought I could walk away from it, but I can't. And now, they want something from me. Something I can't give them." Her mind spun. The man she had married, the one who had appeared so kind and generous, was tangled in something far darker than she could have imagined. Her heart hammered in her chest as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, but they created a picture so disturbing that she could hardly breathe. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why didn't you warn me?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "Why keep me in the dark? You've put me in the middle of all this without any choice." "I didn't want you to know," he answered, his voice shaking. "I wanted to protect you, but I see now I've failed you. I've kept you away from the truth, but the truth always comes out, doesn't it? And now you're in danger too. They know who you are, and they know how much you mean to me. They will stop at nothing to get what they want." A cold chill ran down her spine. The words "they know who you are" echoed in her mind, and she felt the gravity of the situation sink in. It wasn't just about her husband's past anymore, it was about her, too. She had been unknowingly dragged into a web of deceit, danger, and betrayal. "What do they want from you?" she asked, the question escaping her lips, before she could stop it. She needed to know. She needed to understand what she was up against. He closed his eyes, as if the weight of the question had crushed him. "They want me to give them something I've been hiding. A secret from my past that they believe will make them untouchable. But I can't. I won't. I've spent my whole life trying to distance myself from that part of me, but they won't let me go." She felt her world spinning faster and faster, the room around her blurring. She had married a man whose past had been built on lies, and now, it seemed, the very foundation of their life together was crumbling beneath them. The young woman had thought that wealth, love, and luxury would shield her from harm, but now she saw how fragile it all was. "What is it you've been hiding?" she asked, almost afraid to hear the answer, but knowing that it was the only way forward. He hesitated, his eyes dark with regret. "I can't tell you. Not yet. But you need to trust me. You need to believe that I'm doing this to protect you." His voice broke on the last word, and she could see the exhaustion and the fear in his eyes. Her mind raced as she processed his words. She had married a man who had promised her everything, yet it seemed like he had been hiding a life filled with unimaginable darkness. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that he was still the man she had fallen in love with. But the truth was too much to ignore. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore," she whispered, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. The pain in his eyes was evident. "I understand. But I need you to trust me just a little longer. I promise, when the time is right, I will tell you everything. But right now, it's too dangerous." The room fell silent again, the tension between them thick and unbearable. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear: her life had changed forever. There was no going back. The woman who had married a millionaire had no idea just how deep the shadows of his past went. And as the night stretched on, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever be able to leave it behind. The following days were a blur of anxiety and uncertainty. The young woman couldn't escape the feeling that everything she had once known was slipping away. Every glance at her husband filled her with more doubt, and every corner of their lavish home seemed to echo with the weight of secrets she was only beginning to uncover. She tried to go about her daily routine, but it felt like she was walking through a fog. The joy she had once felt from their shared moments now seemed hollow. Every smile from her husband now carried a hidden weight, and she found herself questioning everything. The letters, the photographs, the box, each piece of the puzzle had only led her to more questions, and yet, her husband remained silent. She began to watch him more closely, noting his every movement, every gesture, trying to catch a glimpse of the man she thought she knew. But all she saw was a man who seemed trapped by his own past, his every action weighted by a life he couldn't escape. He no longer looked like the man who had promised her a future filled with happiness. Now, he seemed like a ghost of that man, haunted by things she couldn't understand. The unease turned into restlessness. The more she tried to convince herself that he was still the man she married, the more she realized how little she knew about him. One evening, she caught him in the study again, this time with a strange look on his face, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone. His hands trembled as he fumbled with a set of old papers. The young woman's heart pounded in her chest. She knew he was hiding something from her, and she could no longer stand it. "Who are you waiting for?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. Her husband froze, caught in the act, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing filling the space between them. Finally, he turned toward her, his face drawn, his eyes dark with fear. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice barely audible. "Then what is it, Henry?" she demanded, stepping closer. "What have you been hiding from me all this time? Who are these people who you're so afraid of? What do they want from you?" He took a deep breath, as if preparing for something, and finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I didn't want you involved in this. But now, you've seen too much. They're coming for me, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." Her stomach turned at his words. She could feel the weight of his fear in every syllable. These were not just idle threats, these were real, dangerous people, and she was now a part of it. The life she thought she had would never be the same. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly, reaching out to him. But his expression remained grim. "They won't stop until they get what they want," he whispered. "And I can't let that happen to you. I should have told you everything from the start, but I didn't. Now it's too late. What is it you're hiding, Henry? What is it that could put our lives in danger?" He hesitated for a long moment, then stood up and walked toward the corner of the room, where a large, ornate chest sat. He knelt down and slowly opened it, revealing a stack of papers and photographs that looked even older than the ones she had seen before. His hands shook as he sifted through them, pulling out a small, weathered document. "I've been trying to get rid of this for years," he said, his voice strained. "But it's been haunting me, and now they know. They've found it." The young woman approached cautiously, her heart racing as she looked at the document in his hands. It was a contract, but not just any contract, it was a legal document tied to an illicit business deal that had involved people in positions of power. The names on the contract were not just ordinary criminals, they were people with vast resources and influence. Powerful people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. This is the thing they've been after, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It's worth more than money, it's a secret that could ruin everything. My involvement with them, with what they've done, is something I can't escape. And now you're part of it too. Her mind reeled. Her husband, the man she had married, was more than just a wealthy businessman. He was tangled in a network of corruption and crime, and she was standing right in the middle of it. The pieces that she had been trying to put together had suddenly fallen into place, but they painted a picture far darker than she could have ever imagined. Is there any way out of this? She asked, her voice breaking. Can't we just walk away from it all? He shook his head slowly, his face grim. It's too late. They've found us. And they won't let us go. The weight of his words sank into her like a stone. The life she had wanted, the future she had imagined, was slipping through her fingers. There was no turning back now. She was in this with him, whether she was ready or not. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the true extent of the danger they were in. The man she had married had a past filled with darkness, and now, it was coming for them both. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear, the path ahead would be far more treacherous than she ever imagined. Her mind raced with questions, but there was only one thought that stood out above the rest. Could their marriage, built on lies and secrets, survive the truth that was now threatening to destroy everything? The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. The young woman could no longer pretend that everything was fine. She watched her husband closely, every action of his weighed down by the dark knowledge he had kept hidden from her. He was no longer the man she had married, he was someone else entirely. Someone deeply enmeshed in a world of secrets, lies, and threats. And now, it seemed, she was trapped in that world too. Her nights were sleepless, filled with restless thoughts of the document, the contract, and the men who were hunting him. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of her eye, made her wonder if they were being watched, if the people he had warned her about were already here. She had known they were in danger, but the reality of it, the immediacy of the threat, was starting to feel too close. There was no escaping it. The young woman had tried to confront her husband more than once after the night they had opened the chest. She demanded to know everything, who these people were, what they wanted, how deep his involvement went, but every time, he would shut her out, retreating further into himself, unwilling or unable to give her the answers she so desperately needed. He was so consumed with fear, so terrified of the past catching up with them, that he couldn't see how much she was suffering from his silence. The more he withdrew, the more she felt the weight of the situation crushing her. One evening, as she sat alone in the living room, staring out the window into the darkness, she heard the faintest knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost tentative, but it was there. Her heart skipped a beat, and she rose from her seat, moving cautiously toward the door. Her mind raced. Was it one of the people her husband had warned her about? Was it someone coming to finish what they had started? She opened the door slowly, and there, standing on the porch, was a man she had never seen before. He was tall, his face hidden beneath a hood, but the moment she saw his eyes, a chill ran down her spine. There was something unnerving about him, something cold and calculating in the way he looked at her. His gaze locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to freeze. "I need to speak with your husband," the man said, his voice low, almost robotic, as if he had rehearsed these words countless times before. The young woman's breath caught in her throat. She hesitated for a moment, uncertainty clouding her thoughts. What was this man here for? Should she let him in? She wanted to ask him what he wanted, who he was, but she couldn't find her voice. "He's not here," she finally managed to say, the words coming out more defensively than she intended. The man seemed to consider this for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "I'm afraid that's not the case," he said, his tone sharp. "I know he's here. You should let me in." Fear gripped her heart. She didn't know this man, but something in his voice told her that he wasn't someone who took no for an answer. Every instinct in her screamed to shut the door and run, but something stopped her. The man's presence felt like a dark shadow that pressed down on everything around her, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. Instead of answering, she took a step back, her eyes flicking toward the hallway. Was her husband really gone? Or was he hiding, waiting for the right moment to come out? She couldn't be sure anymore. Everything felt wrong. Before she could react, the man stepped forward, brushing past her and entering the house without permission. He didn't need an invitation, his presence alone filled the space. He was a force, unsettling and dominant. The young woman stood frozen for a moment, not sure whether to scream or run, but before she could move, he spoke again. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice low and almost gentle, as if trying to soothe her fear. "But if you want to stay safe, you'll need to listen carefully." She could hardly breathe, and her voice caught in her throat. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" His lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't need to know who I am. What you need to know is that your husband has something that doesn't belong to him. Something that many people would kill for." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And he's in over his head." "You both are." She didn't know what to think. This man seemed to know everything. He spoke with a cold certainty that left her with no doubt he was involved in whatever mess her husband had gotten into. But why was he here? Was he a threat? Or was he here to offer help? "If you want to survive this," the man continued, "you need to help him. You need to stop running from the truth. This isn't something he can handle alone anymore. And it's certainly not something you can ignore." Her mind raced as his words sank in. Everything her husband had told her, all the things he had hidden, were real. The people from his past, the dangerous people, now they had found her. But what could she do? She had no idea how deep the web stretched, or who this man truly worked for. Her husband had been lying to her to protect her, but in doing so, he had made things worse. She was already tangled in this mess, and the man standing before her was proof that there was no easy way out. "Who are you working for?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the fear in her chest making her feel small and helpless. The man's smile deepened, but his eyes never softened. "You'll know soon enough. But for now, you have to trust me. Trust that I'm here to help you both." The young woman didn't know what to say. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone in this twisted mess her life had become? Before she could respond, the man turned, moving toward the door. "Tell your husband to meet me tomorrow. There's no more time to waste." With that, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but an overwhelming sense of dread. As she closed the door behind him, the weight of everything she had learned, everything she had been through, felt unbearable. She had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear: her life, and her husband's, were in far more danger than she had ever imagined. And now, the real battle for survival was just beginning. The following day, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unease. The young woman couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was on the horizon, something she couldn't escape. Her husband had returned the night before, looking disheveled, more exhausted than she had ever seen him. She wanted to ask him what had happened, to demand answers, but she could see the weight of his own fear in his eyes. He was a man consumed by his past, and no matter how hard she tried to reach him, he was slipping further away. She watched him from the doorway as he paced the living room, his hands running through his hair as he muttered to himself. He was unraveling, and it hurt her to see it. He wasn't the man she had fallen in love with. That man was gone, replaced by someone who was drowning in the very secrets he had tried to keep hidden. When he noticed her standing there, he stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said, his voice rough. "I don't know how to protect you. I've made too many mistakes. I never should have dragged you into this." She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "It's too late for that now. We're both in this, Henry. The man who came here last night, he knows everything. He said you're in over your head, that we can't run from this anymore." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, his face pale. You spoke to him? He asked, his voice shaking. What did he say? He said we have no choice but to face this, that you're involved with people who will stop at nothing to get what they want, she replied. He said I have to trust him if I want us to survive. Her husband's expression hardened. You don't trust him. You can't trust anyone in this world. His voice grew desperate, and he stepped toward her, grabbing her hands in his. I never wanted this for you. You deserve so much more than this. But there's no turning back now. There's no way out of this mess. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them back. She had to be strong now. Tell me everything, Henry. I need to know what's really going on. I can't keep living in the dark. For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes darting to the floor as if the weight of his past was too much to bear. Then, with a deep sigh, he spoke. I've been involved with a group of people who don't care about morality. They only care about power, about money. I used to think I could control it, that I could keep it separate from my life with you. But I was wrong. The moment we got married, it all came crashing down. He paused, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the chair. They've been coming for me for years, but now they know I've been hiding something from them. There's something I took, something they want back. And they'll do whatever it takes to get it. The young woman's heart skipped a beat. What did you take? What is it they want? He swallowed hard, avoiding her gaze. It's a ledger. A list of names, transactions, everything they've done, illegal deals, money laundering, even worse. It's proof of everything they've been involved in. If it ever got out, it would ruin them. So they're coming after me, after us. Her mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. This was bigger than anything she had imagined. She had married a man who had been keeping secrets from her, secrets that were now threatening to destroy their lives. The truth was darker than she could have ever conceived. We need to go to the authorities, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. We can't keep running. We need help. He shook his head vehemently. No. They have too much power. The authorities are compromised. If we go to them, they'll know. And we'll be dead before we even get a chance to speak. Her mind spun. She had no idea what to do, where to turn. The options seemed endless and yet, at the same time, completely hopeless. They were trapped in a game they couldn't win. The silence that followed was suffocating. It seemed like the walls were closing in on them, like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can keep living like this. She took a step back, her eyes flicking toward the hallway. Was her husband really gone? Or was he hiding, waiting for the right moment to come out? She couldn't be sure anymore. Everything felt wrong. Before she could react, the man stepped forward, brushing past her and entering the house without permission. He didn't need an invitation, his presence alone filled the space. He was a force, unsettling and dominant. The young woman stood frozen for a moment, not sure whether to scream or run, but before she could move, he spoke again. I'm not here to hurt you, he said, his voice low and almost gentle, as if trying to soothe her fear. But if you want to stay safe, you'll need to listen carefully. She could hardly breathe, and her voice caught in her throat. Who are you? What do you want from us? His lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. You don't need to know who I am. What you need to know is that your husband has something that doesn't belong to him. Something that many people would kill for. He paused, his gaze unwavering. And he's in over his head. You both are. She didn't know what to think. This man seemed to know everything. He spoke with a cold certainty that left her with no doubt he was involved in whatever mess her husband had gotten into. But why was he here? Was he a threat? Or was he here to offer help? If you want to survive this, the man continued, you need to help him. You need to stop running from the truth. This isn't something he can handle alone anymore. And it's certainly not something you can ignore. Her mind raced as his words sank in. Everything her husband had told her, all the things he had hidden, were real. The people from his past, the dangerous people, now they had found her. But what could she do? She had no idea how deep the web stretched, or who this man truly worked for. Her husband had been lying to her to protect her, but in doing so, he had made things worse. She was already tangled in this mess, and the man standing before her was proof that there was no easy way out. "Who are you working for?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the fear in her chest making her feel small and helpless. The man's smile deepened, but his eyes never softened. "You'll know soon enough. But for now, you have to trust me. Trust that I'm here to help you both." The young woman didn't know what to say. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone in this twisted mess her life had become? Before she could respond, the man turned, moving toward the door. "Tell your husband to meet me tomorrow. There's no more time to waste." With that, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but an overwhelming sense of dread. As she closed the door behind him, the weight of everything she had learned, everything she had been through, felt unbearable. She had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear: her life, and her husband's, were in far more danger than she had ever imagined. And now, the real battle for survival. The following day, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unease. The young woman couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was on the horizon, something she couldn't escape. Her husband had returned the night before, looking disheveled, more exhausted than she had ever seen him. She wanted to ask him what had happened, to demand answers, but she could see the weight of his own fear in his eyes. He was a man consumed by his past, and no matter how hard she tried to reach him, he was slipping further away. She watched him from the doorway as he paced the living room, his hands running through his hair as he muttered to himself. He was unraveling, and it hurt her to see it. He wasn't the man she had fallen in love with. That man was gone, replaced by someone who was drowning in the very secrets he had tried to keep hidden. When he noticed her standing there, he stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said, his voice rough. "I don't know how to protect you. I've made too many mistakes. I never should have dragged you into this." She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "It's too late for that now. We're both in this, Henry. The man who came here last night, he knows everything. He said you're in over your head, that we can't run from this anymore." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, his face pale. "You spoke to him?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What did he say?" "He said we have no choice but to face this, that you're involved with people who will stop at nothing to get what they want," she replied. "He said I have to trust him if I want us to survive." Her husband's expression hardened. "You don't trust him. You can't trust anyone in this world." His voice grew desperate, and he stepped toward her, grabbing her hands in his. "I never wanted this for you. You deserve so much more than this. But there's no turning back now. There's no way out of this mess." Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them back. She had to be strong now. "Tell me everything, Henry. I need to know what's really going on. I can't keep living in the dark." For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes darting to the floor as if the weight of his past was too much to bear. Then, with a deep sigh, he spoke. "I've been involved with a group of people who don't care about morality. They only care about power, about money. I used to think I could control it, that I could keep it separate from my life with you. But I was wrong. The moment we got married, it all came crashing down." He paused, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the chair. "They've been coming for me for years, but now they know I've been hiding something from them. There's something I took, something they want back. And they'll do whatever it takes to get it." The young woman's heart skipped a beat. "What did you take? What is it they want?" He swallowed hard, avoiding her gaze. "It's a ledger. A list of names, transactions, everything they'd done, illegal deals, money laundering, even worse. It's proof of everything they've been involved in. If it ever got out, it would ruin them. So they're coming after me, after us. Her mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. This was bigger than anything she had imagined. She had married a man who had been keeping secrets from her, secrets that were now threatening to destroy their lives. The truth was darker than she could have ever conceived. "We need to go to the authorities," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "We can't keep running. We need help." He shook his head vehemently. "No. They have too much power. The authorities are compromised. If we go to them, they'll know. And we'll be dead before we even get a chance to speak." Her mind spun. She had no idea what to do, where to turn. The options seemed endless and yet, at the same time, completely hopeless. They were trapped in a game they couldn't win. The silence that followed was suffocating. It seemed like the walls were closing in on them, like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can keep living like this." Her husband took her hand and looked her in the eyes, his expression filled with pain and regret. "I never wanted to drag you into this. But I don't have a choice anymore. You're right, we have to face it, together. There's no more running. But I need you to trust me. Whatever happens, we face it as one." She looked at him, seeing the broken man in front of her, the man who had once promised her the world but was now desperately trying to keep them both alive. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't walk away now. She was already in too deep. "I'm with you," she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. "We'll face it together." Her heart pounded in her chest as she spoke the words, but deep down, she knew that there was no turning back. The storm that was coming would be the ultimate test of their love, their strength, and their will to survive. What happened next would determine everything. Would they stand together, or would they be torn apart by the very secrets that had brought them together in the first place? The young woman didn't know the answer, but she knew that, for better or worse, her life with him was about to change forever. The following morning came with a heaviness in the air that neither of them could shake. The night had been long, filled with quiet conversations and whispered promises, but the truth remained unchanged. The danger was real, and it was closing in fast. Her husband had been right, there was no running, no hiding from what was coming. They had to face it. They had to confront the past that had haunted him for years. As they sat together at breakfast, the tension between them was palpable. The young woman could feel the fear radiating off her husband, the deep sense of dread that had settled in his chest. He hadn't slept, his eyes red and tired, but his mind was somewhere else, consumed by the past. She watched him, wondering how someone so broken could still carry so much weight on his shoulders. How had he lived like this for so long? "What are we going to do?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. "How do we even start to fix this?" Her husband's eyes met hers, but they were distant, lost in thought. "I don't know. I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. The people I'm dealing with, there's no reasoning with them. They don't care about anything but getting what they want, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." His words were heavy, and the young woman felt a chill spread through her. She had seen fear in his eyes before, but now it was different. It was raw, almost desperate. She reached out, placing her hand over his, hoping to offer some comfort, but even she wasn't sure how to comfort him anymore. "We can't just wait for them to come to us," she said, her voice shaking with the gravity of the situation. "We have to act first. We need to find a way to protect ourselves, to get ahead of them." Her husband shook his head slowly. "It's too late for that. If they wanted to hurt us, they would have already done it. No. They want something from me. They want the ledger. They want me to give it to them, and if I don't, they'll make sure we pay." The young woman felt her heart drop in her chest. The ledger, the one her husband had hidden away for so long, was the key to everything. It was the one thing that could bring down the people who had made his life a living nightmare. But it was also the one thing that could destroy them both. What happens if you give it to them? She asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Her husband hesitated. His eyes flickered with something dark, something she couldn't quite place. If I give it to them, they'll destroy everything it represents. They'll wipe out the last bit of good I have left. And you, they won't stop with just me. They'll come after you too. The young woman's chest tightened. The man she had married, the man she thought she knew, was now a prisoner to a world she could never understand. And in trying to protect her, he was pushing her deeper into the mess that had already consumed him. We have to find another way, she insisted, her voice growing more determined. There has to be something we can do. He met her gaze, his eyes dark with exhaustion. You don't understand. There's no other way out of this. They've already found us. There's no escaping it. As he spoke, the doorbell rang, its chime cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. Both of them froze. The young woman's heart raced, and her breath caught in her throat. The man who had visited them the night before flashed through her mind. Was this it? Were they here? Her husband stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. Stay here, he said, his voice firm. I'll handle this. But she wasn't about to stay hidden. She followed him, her steps quiet but urgent. She wasn't going to sit by and let him face whatever this was alone. She had been dragged into this world, whether she liked it or not, and now she would have to fight for their lives. Her husband reached the door first, pulling it open slowly. Standing on the other side was the same man from the night before, his face still obscured by the same hood, his eyes cold and calculating. You're late, the man said, his voice low and measured. Her husband stepped back, letting the man in, and for a moment, there was a heavy silence between them. The young woman stood just behind her husband, her heart pounding in her chest, as she tried to make sense of what was happening. I'm here to make sure things go as planned, the man said, stepping further into the room. You've had your time to think, but now we need to move forward. The ledger, Henry. Where is it? Her husband's face twisted with regret, but he remained silent. The young woman could feel the weight of his decision hanging in the air, but she wasn't going to let him make it alone. I told you, we can't give it to you, she said, her voice trembling but firm. We won't be a part of this anymore. The man turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing. You don't have a choice. You never did. You're already in this too deep. The tension in the room was unbearable. The young woman could feel her heart racing as the man's words sank in. Her husband had already tried to walk away, but now they had no choice but to face the consequences of the past. The past that had caught up with them, the past that was threatening to destroy everything. Her husband's voice broke through the silence. We'll do it your way. But you have to promise that this is the end of it. That once it's over, we can walk away and leave this life behind. The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm afraid that's not how it works. The only way this ends is when you give us what we want. Her heart sank as the man's words echoed in her mind. There was no escape. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The ledger had become the center of everything, the key to their survival, but also the very thing that might destroy them. As the man stepped closer, the young woman realized that no matter what happened next, their lives would never be the same again. The choices they made now would define their future, and whether they could find a way out of this nightmare, or if it would consume them, was still uncertain. One thing was clear, there was no going back. The weight of the moment felt crushing as the young woman stood in the doorway, watching the man before them, her heart racing with fear and uncertainty. Her husband, standing beside her, had just agreed to give them what they wanted, the ledger. The price of their survival seemed too high, but the alternative was unimaginable. The truth was, they were both trapped in this dark world now, and the choices they had made were leading them down a path they couldn't turn back from. The man's eyes flickered between them, a hint of satisfaction playing at the corners of his lips. "I'll take what's mine," he said coldly, his voice devoid of any empathy. "And then you'll be free to live out whatever's left of your lives. But know this, you'll never fully escape. People like us don't just disappear." Her husband, pale and worn from the strain of everything that had happened, nodded slowly. The decision had already been made. There was no more time for questions or second thoughts. They had to survive. But the young woman couldn't help but wonder, what was the cost of survival? Would they ever truly be free from this nightmare, or would they forever be haunted by the choices they were forced to make? The man stepped forward, and her husband slowly reached into the drawer where he had hidden the ledger. His hands trembled, and for a moment, she saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear she had seen when he first confessed the truth to her. He was a man broken by his past, a man who had made sacrifices she could never fully understand. And now, he was handing it all over, sacrificing the last part of his soul, to make sure they both survived. Her heart felt heavy as the man took the ledger from her husband's hands, his cold smile never faltering. "This is the end of it, then?" her husband asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were speaking to himself more than the man in front of him. "For you, maybe," the man replied, "but for us, it's just the beginning." The door slammed shut behind him as he left, and the house fell into an eerie silence. The young woman felt a coldness sweep over her. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. She knew that now. Her husband was right, there was no turning back. They had crossed a line, and the consequences of their actions were far from over. But despite the terror that still gripped her heart, a small part of her felt a sense of relief. The ledger was gone. They had given it away. It wasn't in their possession anymore, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, they could start over. If they could rebuild their lives, free from the shadow of his past. But then, as she turned to look at him, the reality of their situation hit her again. Her husband was standing there, his face haunted by the past he could never fully escape. She could see the weight of it in his eyes, in the way he stood so still, so broken. They had given up something precious, something that had been the source of their torment for so long, but in doing so, they had sacrificed a part of themselves. The part that had once been whole, untouched by the darkness that had surrounded them. "What now?" she asked softly, her voice trembling as she walked toward him. He looked at her, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, his gaze softened. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "Now, we try to rebuild. We try to find a way to heal." There was a flicker of hope in his voice, but it was fragile, like something barely clinging to life. The young woman knew that rebuilding wouldn't be easy. It would take time, and it would take courage. They had both been through too much, seen too much, to just walk away from it all. But as he squeezed her hand, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to find peace. There would always be scars, always be memories of the things they had done and the people they had crossed. But maybe they could still find a way to live, to love, to be free from the shadows that had consumed them. It would take work, and it would take faith, but for the first time, the young woman believed it was possible. The world outside felt different somehow, quieter. She could almost hear the sound of their footsteps echoing in the emptiness as they walked toward a future that was uncertain but no longer defined by the past. In the end, the young woman realized that life wasn't about escaping the mistakes we make. It was about learning to live with them, to find a way forward, no matter how dark the path seemed. The hardest part was not facing the danger, it was facing the truth of who they had become, and finding the strength to rebuild what they had almost lost. And as she stood there, hand in hand with her husband, she knew that this was only the beginning of their journey. But whatever came next, they would face it together. And maybe, just maybe, they would find their way back to each other, piece by piece, until they were whole again.